This is the AD History Podcast.
So he spends 6 years there, and if he is being bred for the imperial role, so be it. But in terms of his actual time there, this is where we start getting some interesting insights on the evolving psychological nature and profile of who Caligula was. And that's really where the crux of this segment and our talk about Caligula today is. Because history, in this particular sense, you most certainly have his enemies, more or less, writing the history because they managed to knock him off. They obviously had reason to get rid of him. And then on top of that, they tried to systematically remove him from history. And given how infamous he is, was he mad, bad, dangerous to know? Is this an accurate representation that when I was beginning to mold this segment, I began kind of falling back into my political scientist mode, and I started thinking about a gentleman whose name is Dr. Gerald Post, and he's done a great deal of work for the United States in terms of creating psychological profiles for other world leaders, specifically individuals that we don't have that much access to. People like, say, Kim Jong-un. And in this way, Caligula is not terribly dissimilar. Yes, it's 2,000 years ago, but our access to good information on them personally, due to a lack of general accessibility, in some ways, it can very much pose the same challenge, even though they are alive and Caligula is 2,000 years dead. And so what we're going to do is we're going to begin generating, based on the various conditions and considerations for building such a modern profile, and see if we can get a better understanding of Caligula the man, how he thought, was indeed there some form of mental illness involved, or has history entirely overblown the subject and figure entirely?
From a philosophy of medicine point of view, this is something also called retroactive diagnosis. It's a term loosely used. And we're going to see if he kind of fits into any category of mental disorder syndrome. And I use the word syndrome specifically because it's really impossible to make any sort of diagnosis. We have no interaction with the patient. And as Paul mentioned, it's over 2,000 years ago. So we can only go off of really secondary sources. There's a dearth of primary sources. I believe there's really only one that they have, at least that the historical record has, from Philo, talking about the plight of the Jews of Alexandria. And we can touch base on that a little bit more as we dig deeper. So there's no personal diaries. There's no extensive letter writing for us to analyze. We're going to just look at what we do have and see what we can find.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we're always looking. Patrick and I, this is our common struggle for you and I, Patrick. It's just if we can ever sympathize with Sisyphus in all of this, and that is the constant striving to find some sort of contemporaneous first-hand account, because that's the gold standard. Obviously, there's no true thing as pure objectivity. Everything is a subjective experience when it comes to memory and analyzing events, but in this case, it's particularly difficult. But the first thing that I think is really most interesting when it comes to Caligula, and this is something that sheds a much greater light on the imperial situation and layout as it exists then and going forward. During his time on Capri with Tiberius, apparently he learned very quickly to always shield the outside world from seeing any sort of emotion regardless of what was happening. And Mary Beard tells this great anecdote that really describes what we're talking about here, where you have this proper imperial princess, and they're all sitting down to a meal together. Her brother to her right just drops dead in his food. And what does she do? She keeps on eating as if nothing happened. That is the kind of paranoia and self-control and the ability to completely play it almost impossibly close to the vest in that level of the power dynamics that exist in the imperial setting as we understand it. And there's an interesting, what I would say probably apocryphal quote from Tiberius when he was referring to Caligula. And it goes roughly something like this: the world will scorn the venomous serpent that I'm going to unleash upon it. And to that end, I can't say if he said it or not, but boy, that's certainly what happened from all we can tell. And so he's there for 6 years, and he's seeing all this debauchery around him, one of which is just really quite incredible, where apparently, I think Suetonius talks about this, Tiberius is having people executed by tossing them off a large cliff into the ocean, and if they don't die on impact, he has a few soldiers down there in rowboats that make sure to beat the person to death once they get there. That's the kind of barbarity here we're talking about. And there's even some legitimate question that at the end of this 6-year period, was Caligula the one who ended up murdering Tiberius? It's a legitimate question at this point, and a very strange one to be sure. And so now he's coming into power. He's in power, and he's only in power 4 years. And when he's in power, he's infamous for his cruelty. He's infamous for being erratic and mercurial. Even though he begins his tenure as princeps/emperor with goodwill because he's sought rightfully as the son of Germanicus, based on everything, the few things that we know, and how a profile today would largely look at Caligula. This is basically what's going on. First off, in terms of the setting in which he comes to power, and this is really important, is that right now, Rome is still very much a wounded political body. That transformation from the Senate-ruled republic to empire, where ruling is then a family business, is not an easy nor smooth transition, to be sure. So it is a wounded political body. There's still a lot of jockeying back and forth. And on top of that, it's now become a leader-dominated society. And at this point, a lot of Romans are looking at the princeps or later emperor as a check on the Senate's power, which is something of a misperception, if I would say so myself, because that's where all the power was in the case of the princeps. And now, as far as what we know of Caligula through Suetonius, through Tacitus, based on his erratic nature, how mercurial and just how vicious he could be, we begin seeing somebody that off the bat doesn't have much in the way of an apparent constraint of conscience, with one exception. And that has to do with his relationship with his sister Drusilla. Now, when you're dealing with Caligula and Drusilla, we all know the classic story about Caligula and Drusilla. Once again, we may be explicitly rated, but I'm still not going to touch that. And so when she dies at some point, this is the one area where Caligula truly is not able to control his emotion, because that's just how much he cared for her, for whatever reason that may be. But outside of that, he doesn't seem to have any apparent constraint of conscience.
Along with this lack of constraint of conscience, we're also seeing a significant lack of empathy, with the exception of Drusilla. As I mentioned earlier, we have this one truly personal interaction, contemporaneous personal interaction from Philo, where he has Philo commenting on the plight of the Jews in Alexandria, and Caligula is going on about the glass in his pleasure palace, as if there's nothing going wrong in Alexandria and the Jews aren't being persecuted. So you're having this significant lack of empathy combined with this lack of conscience and impulse control problems, anybody, as we know of Caligula. So combine this together and you're looking at someone who has a syndrome very similar to a narcissistic personality disorder.
Especially when you consider what he was trying to do in terms of self-aggrandizement. because this is something that's interesting about Caligula, and this violates so many taboos. You and I were talking about this, Kristen, before pre-roll, is the fact that during the short reign, he was trying to make it so that he, Caligula, was to be worshipped as a god in Rome itself. And that is a huge no-no. Now, if you are in Greece, if you are in Palestine, if you are in Egypt, yeah, there's plenty of deifying the emperor that's been going on for some time, and it definitely predates Caligula. But now he's violating the taboo to make it so in Rome. And this is something that sends off a lot of alarm bells to a lot of people simply because it's so out of bounds.
Also deifying himself while he's still alive. A huge taboo to Roman societal customs. That's really what helps define any sort of psychological disorder, is not so much that it's just irregular behavior. I mean, how regular is a behavior going to be of a complete autocrat? But that it's irregular within the context of that person's culture. So that was one of the things that definitely stood out to me, was the fact that he allowed his apotheosis to happen while he was still breathing.
So this is where things start also getting even more odd. And we begin seeing certain personality traits in amalgam that are found in various other world leaders, in varying amounts, to be sure. And another one that has to be undeniable in all of this is his paranoid orientation. Now, you can kind of look at this in two ways. You can view it as Caligula just being way over the top, being far too cautious and overly sensitive to the happenings around him. But I think to do that would be doing him a severe discredit, because the fact of the matter is, somebody in his position, and specifically him, certainly had a heck of a lot to be worried and paranoid about, because he got killed by the very people that were meant to protect him. And so when we begin looking further into Caligula, we begin seeing more and more of these very unusual behaviors that undoubtedly led to a very, very unfortunate outcome. But here's the other thing that needs to be looked at that I think is pretty important. You can look at it from a very top-down way. You can look at it in a very personal way. A lot of times as historians or political scientists or people just even in the present, let me ask you a question, Patrick. When you're looking at world events and you're thinking to yourself, what might happen next with a particular country, how do you usually go about them doing that? How do you think in your own mind that you'll be able to predict what they're going to do next?
I normally look into what's happened in situations like that in history. So not so much what's happened in that country in the past, but a similar situation to what that country is going through that's happened in the past, and seeing how it plays out then. And that kind of shapes my idea of what could happen in the future. I guess that's how I do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, Kristen nor myself are any different in that regard. But usually we apply something that is largely known as a rational actor model, meaning that country A with, leader A is faced with said situation. They have finite capabilities, they have specific interest, and based on the scenario, putting ourselves in that position, we believe they will then go on to do X, Y, Z. And unfortunately, in this case, based on the general profile of Caligula, you can't really apply a rational actor model to him. Indeed, for all intents and purposes, based on the little that we know, he is indeed what many political scientists would probably end up calling an irrational actor, which is a very dangerous thing, especially in a system that clearly is still jockeying for some sort of institutional sinews of power that can last under the new arrangement, and where so much is on the line. But in general, this is all very difficult because there is so little to go on.
Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found.